Hi, guys. This is Monday, May 4th, and we're in our final 3 weeks of school, if you can believe it. I know it seems like we still have a lot to do because we still have a whole book that I'm trying to fit in for Lit Circles, but be assured that I'm trying to make at least 3 days out of the 4 days of assignments based on this book so that your reading is included as a part of what I'm assuming you should be working on. So we are going to cut back on how much science fiction we're going to be able to cover. And I'm not going to be having really large writing assessments other than Lit Circle weekly materials over this book to make it manageable. This week, we are jumping into our first digital Lit Circle meeting with our first Google Meet section meeting with your team who was assigned last week. If you listened to the video that I made or read the materials, you hopefully will know how that's going to work. The person who is the summarizer is in charge of setting up the group meet and setting up a time and talking or emailing among yourselves to how or when a best time is to meet to make it easy. You might want to pick the same time and day every week for 3 weeks so that you don't have to do this every week of coordinating when are we going to meet. And then next week, the summarizer will just know our meeting's going to be Thursday at 2. That's what we did last week. So that would make it a little bit easier as far as communicating changes of times. You do need to talk to your team for about 30 minutes, and you need to send me the code invitation and the time and day your group is meeting. That should take place Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday of this week. We are going to continue today with a kind of a lecture over a separate piece, chapters 1 through 5. I'm not going to tell every single thing. I'm going to kind of go more plot based today just to kind of set up the book for you. And then we are going to go more into the symbolism of it as we get further into the book. And then this week, additionally, you should be working on your roll sheets once you've read through chapter 5, which means reading ahead is probably a good thing to do, even maybe further ahead than how I have the chapters divided for the weekly, for the daily discussion board posts. Otherwise, you'll still be working on Lit Circle materials on Thursday night, which might be too late, especially if your group is going to meet on Thursday during the day and those need to already be done. So again, I would suggest you read ahead as much as possible. Is chapters 6 through 10 for next week. So you might want to start right away. Continuing to read a chapter a day would be a good goal. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into chapter 1. First of all, the first thing to note is that it is first-person narration. We have that with Ponyboy in The Outsiders, also with Esperanza in House on Mango Street. And the benefit of this type of point of view is that our protagonist lets us go into his thoughts completely, and we see a one-sided perspective. But what you have to remember, as well as we saw this with Ponyboy and Esperanza, is that the perspective is sometimes biased, which means that it's only skewed towards that person's view of the world, and it may not include accurate perspectives of the other characters. So, for example, Ponyboy thought all the Socias were terrible. At the beginning of Outsiders, he thought that, other Socias judged him. He thought that Cherry was really snobby. All of those things were his perceptions. It didn't mean they were accurate. They were just what he thought in his mind, and he was stereotyping. So we're going to see the same thing in this book. We're going to see that our narrator is a teenager. He's 16 years old. His name is Gene Forrester. And he is going to tell us things about his best friend and roommate named Finney. Finney is short for Phineas. And you just have to remember as you're reading the book that not everything he thinks about Finney is probably true. Not every way that he judges Finney or assumes Finney is doing something against him is necessarily Finney's motivation. It's what Gene perceives it to be happening. And so I think that's just really important because we as humans do that all the time. We put preconceived ideas on what people are doing and we assume and make assumptions about their actions. And that's what Gene is doing in this book, which actually heightens the conflict. And there's a lot of internal conflict in this book where he is, again, struggling with these feelings of, Finney is supposed to be my best friend, but yet does he hate me? Am I jealous of him? Can you be jealous of your best friend and still have a best friend? So those are things I think all of us kind of struggle with. Now, the book is set kind of in historical fiction at the beginning of World War II. So we're looking at like the 1930s or so. It is set in the back east in New Hampshire, in a boarding school where you live on the campus for high school boys, like 9th through 12th grade, boys only, who have headmasters and teachers who live on the campus with them as chaperones, and it's a very high academic pressure school. It is supposed to be loosely based on a real school called Phillips Exeter Academy, which still exists, and it was the school that our author, John Knowles, actually attended. So he could have written this book semi-autobiographically as far as placing the setting in a school very similar to the private boarding school where he attended as a boy in high school, Phillips Exeter Academy. That type of school is extremely expensive. There are many of those back east today. Many of them feed into Ivy League schools like Yale or Harvard and have a high degree of academic pressure. So as you can see in this book, Gene puts a lot of academic pressure on himself and wants to be the top. Valedictorian is his goal, which means top in his graduating class. Finney seems to be a little more gifted athletically more than academically. And so there seems to be this kind of underlying rivalry that Gene doesn't want someone to be his best friend who's better at him than something. The book also, which some of you questioned, is why would he go back to this school and how old is he? The book starts with Gene in his adult life in his 30s. And he tells us in chapter 1 that it's been 15 years since he came back to the Devon school. And that means if he graduated at 18 and it's 15 years later, he's in his 30s. And so he has come back to see two fearful sights, as he describes them. And he takes us to them in chapter 1. One was the tree out by the river, and then the other was a marble staircase inside the First Academy building. Now, again, we don't know why those are fearful sights. That was part of the quote, but that should have been connotation that let you know that something bad happened in both of those locations, and he's coming back to campus to revisit that memory. Now, some of you thought maybe he missed the school, he loved the school. Yes, but if he's saying they're fearful sights, we have to remember that maybe there's a different emotion, like maybe guilt or maybe some sort of amends that he wants to make by coming back this many years later. Something happened that was so tragic, he's never been able to fully have closure from this experience. And so he's coming back as an adult to his former high school. The flashback starts in the beginning of chapter 1 when he says, in my book, it's about 4 pages in, but if you're using the PDF version, it's going to be different. But on the paperback version, it's page 14. He says, the tree was tremendous, an irate, steely black steeple beside the river. I'd be damned if I climbed it. So again, that's where he starts going into the flashback to when he was 16. The rest of the book, until the last chapter, is a flashback. So the whole book is a flashback of something that happened in high school. And then he goes back to his adult narrator voice in the very last chapter when he kind of tells us this story about what happened when he was in high school. Again, Gene states a line that's really important to kind of hint that death and violence are going to be involved in this book, because he says, nothing endures, not a tree, not love, not even a death by violence, which implies there's a death, which implies there's violence, and we don't know enough yet to know what it is. He jumps into the flashback where he says he remembers that they were in summer school. So some of you posted questions about why is it summer and he's at school. There is a summer session, just like U of A has a summer session, and this is an elite boarding school that has a lot of academic pressure. Some students would stay and take a light load in the summer to get extra credits. So he's on campus taking summer school classes for maybe 6 weeks, 8 weeks or so of his summer. His best friend is Finney, who seems much more reckless and daring and athletic than him. And Gene always seems to have a lot of worries going on in his mind. He's what we call a very type A kind of structured personality, and Finney's a very fly by the seat of your pants, spontaneous personality, and we can tell they're very opposite. And those opposite traits doesn't make one of them better than the other, but it definitely causes Gene to feel stress because he wants to be accepted by Finney, who always is throwing out these crazy ideas, maybe reckless adventures, skipping class. And those things really cause Gene a lot of stress because he's extremely structured and wants to do well in school. Yet he's never telling Finney no. He doesn't say, I don't want to do these things till later in the book. So he goes along with them, but yet internally he's sharing with us how much he resents it. And that causes him to also resent their friendship. Again, Gene seems to struggle with Finney's expectations, like jumping out of the tree. He didn't want to jump out of the tree. But we have to remember, Gene never said, I don't want to jump out of the tree. He just internally is resenting it and saying something like, why did I let Finney talk me into stupid things like this? Was he getting some kind of a hold on me? So again, I would think we would maybe categorize that as peer pressure to some degree. This book does struggle with the idea of pleasing other people, peer pressure, following other people's expectations, fear of standing up for yourself, and then also the consequences if you don't. So again, that's sort of the introduction to just the character types that we have in chapter 1. In chapter 2, we can see that Finney starts getting away with all sorts of things. He's a rule breaker, and Gene is not a rule breaker. And those are two really opposites in their personalities that cause stress. So Finney can impress all the teachers, all the adults love him. Every time he gets in trouble, he has this amazing ability to make up lies and talk on the spot to be able to kind of schmooze his way out of the complication and get the adults to laugh. And then he gets away with these things that make Gene actually really mad. Gene realizes he's starting to envy this trait that Finney has to get away with things and not get in trouble. And he almost wants him to get caught to prove to him that he's not better, that he should get caught, that he should be punished because he would get caught. Again, one of the first things that happens is Finney decides to break the dress code. They have a school uniform, so that's what's implied in this chapter. They have blazers and dress pants and things like that in a very formal school. And there were consequences and demerits if you were out of dress code. So Finney decides he's going to break the dress code because it's getting to be wartime and he's trying to make a protest statement. And he puts on a pink shirt, as he calls an emblem. Now, Jean is jealous and says this quote, "No one else in the school could have done so without some risk from having it torn from his back, but I couldn't help envying him a little," which was perfectly normal. There's no harm in envying your best friend a little. So one of the universal ideas in the book that I already mentioned is the idea of envy, and also that contradictory idea we have to question. If someone is your friend, can you envy them? Is it okay to envy your friend, or does that negate the friendship and means they're actually your enemy? So those are the types of philosophical questions that come up in this book. Is Jean really Finney's friend, or is he faking because inside he's really boiling in anger and jealousy? Now, again, another time happens in chapter 2 where Finney doesn't have the correct belt and ties a tie around his waist as a belt to keep his pants up, but he gets caught for wearing the tie instead of the traditional belt that's part of the school-issued uniform. And Jean finds himself wanting again for him to get in trouble and get consequences. But Finney talks his way out of it again, and we begin to see this idea that Jean is jealous. Finney also invents in this chapter a summer club, which is alliteration. I know Riley pointed that out to me and sent me an email, so that was good job, Riley. Super Suicide Society of the Summer Session, which uses the S's. And I think, again, we've had that idea that the S, the hiss, is usually negative connotation. So even though it sounds like they're having a lot of fun in the Super Suicide Society, I want you to realize by the end of chapter 5, when we get there, there's a huge dramatic turn of what happens by jumping out of the tree, which is part of this club initiation, and it turns kind of sinister at that point. So this S's, the Super Suicide Society of the Summer Session, is actually foreshadowing that something bad is probably going to happen by this initiation ritual and the jumping out of the tree. In this chapter, we actually have this idea that Jean doesn't want to jump, but he goes up into the tree and he almost falls. And the tree is over a bank into the river. So if you fell off a branch too soon, you would hit the river bank. You have to jump out and go far enough off to jump into the water for safety. And Jean almost falls, but Finney stabilizes him and he says he almost saved his life. Now, that's going to be really interesting and kind of a juxtaposition to chapter 5 when we have the reverse thing happen, that Finney almost falls, but Jean does not save him. So we're going to see the two opposites. In this case, Finney did catch him and help him not fall. In chapter 3, we again to be able to see Finney's athleticism as kind of the focus. He's very competitive, and Jean is just kind of trying to keep up as he's not naturally as athletic. And then Finney also invents a game which makes him look like a hero, and he's very good at it, called Blitzball. And Blitzball is actually from a World War II term called Blitzkrieg, which is a military tactic of attack. And so again, the author is starting to drop these words and hints in that it is wartime. Wartime is still pretty far away from the boys at this point by maybe a school year. They're not dwelling on it a lot, but it's in the back of their minds. But again, as the war kind of escalates and the United States gets more involved in it, by the middle to end of the book, the war will become a very significant thing, and World War II will be full blown. The draft will be enacted, and some of the upperclassmen who are already 17, 18 will be facing either the option to enlist voluntarily as younger boys, or they will be 18 and they will be drafted. So again, the idea that Blitzkrieg is mentioned is significant because it reminds us and drops those ideas that this is actually about to be wartime. And yet right now they're not involved in war. They're involved in only the war of a game, not the real war. But the real war is another level of conflict that's going to get closer and closer and closer to Devon's school. And so again, he says this quote about Finney's athleticism, that he could shine with everyone and he attracted everyone he met. I was glad of that too. Naturally, he was my roommate and best friend. Now, at this point, he's trying to convince himself, I think, that he actually is a good friend, but I think we're beginning to wonder if he really is because he's jealous so much of the time. His internal narration often complains about Finney, but then he tries to reassure himself that that's normal. Everybody's jealous of your friends. It's not a big deal, but we can automatically see there's a huge internal conflict going on with Jean. Another thing that happens in this chapter that kind of shows Finney's personality as being actually really positive is he breaks the school swimming record. And it was done with no witnesses, just him by himself and Jean trying to see if he could do it. And of course, Jean even suggests, let's get it timed, let's go do it again, let's repeat it to make it official. And Finney has no interest in that, which is interesting because that kind of disproves Jean's theory that Finney only wants recognition. If he only wanted recognition, he would definitely want to prove this swimming record in an official time setting. So I guess what we can see from this is that maybe Jean's perception of Finney is not really who Finney is, because Finney has no reason to have to prove his athleticism. He just did this for himself, and he's perfectly at peace with it. But Jean is the one who's portraying him as being very arrogant or very competitive, when maybe that's not Finney's really goal at all. At the end of the chapter, Finney convinces Jean to skip class and go to the beach against his better judgment. That ends up again causing conflict because Jean comes back and fails a test again, which is in the next chapter. But at the end of this chapter, when they fall asleep at the beach, Finney actually kind of has an emotional admission and calls Jean his best friend, which he said was very odd in a boys' school where everybody trying to be really manly and tough, for a guy, a teenage boy, to actually tell another teenage boy, you're my best pal. And Jean, what's interesting in this, could not say it back. And he heard Finney, but he just said something in me was unable to repeat it. And he was unable to tell him back to him that they were best friends. And again, he realizes that something held me back, which might be that maybe he feels that he doesn't know if Finney's really his best friend, and he feels guilt over it. Chapter 4 resumes immediately where they wake up and he comes back late to campus because they skipped school and went to the beach. And of course, he takes a test he was unprepared for, which is very unlike him, and he fails it. And his first instinct is to, of course, blame Finney because Finney made me go. But again, we have to think about that whole idea is if you're involved in peer pressure, how much of that is really your responsibility to say no versus the other person tempting you? And in this case, Jean is not saying no. He's going along with everything and then getting mad because his grades are slipping. Jean comes up with this idea in this chapter that it's Finney's fault that his grades are bad. It's Finney's fault he's dropping his focus of school, and that this is maybe all Finney's diabolical plan to bring him down by getting him to be so busy with the Super Suicide Society and having him attend all these meetings and then skip classes, and that his whole goal is to wreck his studies so he won't graduate at the top of his class and maybe Finney can beat him. So he says, Finney had deliberately set out to wreck my studies. It was cold trickery. It was all calculated. It was all enmity. And enmity is a big vocab word, but it just means hatred. So we have to ask ourselves again, since we have a first-person narrator, whether or not that's really true. Is Finney trying to keep Jean really busy? Is he trying to get him so involved in the club and skipping school because he desires to beat him academically? Is that his motive? If so, then he's actually a really bad person. If not, then maybe Jean is just actually the really jealous person. So we remember we only see one side of the story through Jean's eyes. Now later, Jean gets really mad in this chapter and ends up telling Finney that he's tired of all these meetings. He has to study, and he expects this big pushback that Finney is going to argue that he has to go or get kicked out of the Super Suicide Society. And what happens is exactly the opposite of what Jean expects. Finney says, I had no idea you needed to study. I just thought you were naturally smart. You stay here and study. It's not a problem. And now Finney's encouraging him to study. So then it kind of blows Jean's idea that this was all going to be this premeditated way for him to wreck his grade point average. And Jean realizes that maybe he is the bad friend. And he thinks in this quote, now I knew that there never was and never could be any rivalry between us. I was not of the same quality as he. And in this moment, we begin to see that maybe Finney never had these underlying motives, and it's really just Jean being insecure. At the end of the chapter, Finney and Jean are supposed to do a jump out of the tree again for the Super Suicide Society, and they suggest they do a double jump where they both get up into the tree together and jump at the same time, which is a little harder to do because the limb would bounce with two people's body weight on it, and you have to have a better balance so that one person doesn't fall off before you're both ready to jump. When they are on the limb, Jean, it says, jounces, which means bounces the limb. And Finney falls, and he can't catch himself. And this was, again, that juxtaposition to the earlier chapter 2, where Jean almost fell, but Finney caught him. In this chapter, Finney falls, and Jean can't catch him. And it even goes to the point of making us wonder, was this intentional or not? Again, at the end of this chapter, I don't think if even Jean knows if it's intentional or not. He says, I jounced the limb. Finney, his balance gone, swung his head around to look at me for an instant with extreme interest, and he tumbled sideways, broke through the little branches below, and hit the bank with a sickening, unnatural thud. It was the first clumsy physical action I'd ever seen him make. Now, the question that's going to be the driving question now throughout the whole book that determines the conflict of the book is, was this an accident? Or did Jean actually intend for Finney to fall and want him to fall and maybe bounce the limb on purpose to cause him to fall? Now, I do want to clarify because a lot of students think that it was like he shoved him out of the tree. He did not touch him. He did not shove him. He did not push him. By jouncing the limb, it means bouncing. So we have to look into that as we continue the book about whether Gene intentionally wanted his friend to fall. Did he bend his knees and intentionally bounce the limb, hoping that Finney would fall off? Or was it a complete accident? And again, I don't necessarily know if the book is going to ever answer that specifically, but there are lots of scenes we're going to analyze where they get into that conversation, including chapter 5. Chapter 5 does take us a little bit through a few months of time. Initially, the doctor tells us that Finney will recover, his leg will be okay, but the problem is that he'll never be able to play competitive sports at the high school level again or college level because his injury was too severe, and he tells the friends that he's going to have to not be in sports, which would be a huge blow to someone whose entire identity was of the school athlete. When Gene goes to see Finney at the hospital, he asks him what happened, kind of trying to figure out if he thinks that Gene was at fault or not. But Finney seems to think it was just an accident. And he just says, I fell, and doesn't seem to have any blame towards Gene. They do leave for a short break at the end of the summer session before the fall semester begins. They might have several weeks off, and they live in different states because it's a boarding school. So Gene goes home to the South because he's from the South, and then Finney's from Boston. And so he goes home to his parents' house where he's going to recuperate and actually miss the first quarter of school and come back late because of his leg injury. So Gene, at the end of that summer break, before he comes back for fall, decides to stop by the Boston house to see Finney on his way back to campus. And he goes and confesses during this visit, and he says, quote, I caused it. I deliberately jounced the limb so you would fall off. Now, that's probably the clearest confession he could actually say. He's intent on maybe getting this guilt off his chest that he's been dealing with for about a month. And he wants to tell Finney, I caused the accident. It was me. But Finney actually, his response is kind of unusual. He gets really angry and he doesn't want to hear this. And he tells him, no, you didn't. And then Gene realizes that this confession that he had just made is actually worse than not telling him. So again, he says, of course you didn't do it. Sit down. You're a fool. I'm going to hit you if you don't sit down. I'm going to kill you if you don't shut up. And then he says, just go away. I'm tired of you. You make me sick. Just go away. So Finney's reaction is very volatile. He does not want Gene to tell him, I hurt you. So you're going to have to think about why. Why would Finney not want to hear this? Ultimately, I think it's because he realizes that if Gene did this on purpose, they can't be friends. And he doesn't want to lose him as a friend because it's his best friend. And he doesn't want to believe this about him. So he just doesn't want to hear it because if he doesn't hear it, it doesn't happen. So again, Gene says, it struck me then I was injuring him again. It occurred to me this could be an even deeper injury than what I had done before. I would have to back out of it. I would have to disown it. So he ends up just kind of acting like, yeah, you're right. It was just an accident, and kind of tries to play it off. And that's what he's going to do for a little bit longer in the book as well. So that's where chapter 5 ends. And chapter 6 will have you with Finney still gone, still at his parents' house in Boston, and Gene going back to school with him not there and missing the roommate who's not in his dorm, sharing his room any longer for a little while until he reappears. So that will be the chapters we start for next week. So hopefully that clarifies a little bit about what happened in these chapters. And we're going to have on Wednesday 2 different times that you can choose to come in. I think I put 10 and 1 possibly. I'll have to double check that, but it's on the slide for the agenda for the week. There are going to be 2 times on Wednesday that you can pop into one of them and have a live Google Meet discussion with me. And we can analyze some of these chapters and you can ask questions. And that might help you as you're doing your Lit Circle job for the week, that you could get into a discussion to clarify any specific things you didn't understand as you are reading. So be joining us, and hopefully we'll see you on Wednesday for one of our live Google Meets over this book. And then your group will discuss either Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday. You could even do it Saturday if you really want to work on the weekend, but you don't need to unless that's just best for your group. And then you need to turn in your individual roll sheets by the preferred date is Friday for week 1. And those are listed under the Lit Circle tab in the classwork area, just like we've always had it there. And you just pick the job handout that you need and then delete the other 3 and then turn in only the one you're responsible for. And that will be 30 unassisted points as always. So keep reading, hang in there. It is a challenging book, but it's a good book. And if you don't understand everything, that's okay. This is a challenging stretch text for the end of 7th grade pre-AP. But it is a book I think you can get enough out of that you can still, it'll help you raise your reading level with the level of vocabulary and the sentence structure that it uses. So do your best. I'm going to try to make it as manageable as possible, so don't fear, and I will see you later. Have a good night.